A guilt-ridden playwright returns to the burned ruins of his theater, haunted by the ghosts of his cast. As he obsessively rewrites their final play to seek redemption, the line between art, guilt, and the afterlife blurs in a descent into madness. The currency.
Jonah kept his things small. It was not a loneliness of spectacle, no dramatic withdrawals or theatrical refusals, but the kind of economy that prefers a single, well-worn cup to a cabinet full of unused dishes. On mornings when the fog lay low and the quay smelled of coal and the iron tang of 100 worn ropes, he would move among the stalls and the wet warehouses carrying jars at his hip. They were ordinary jars, with screw tops and cloudy glass, some of them fitted with reeds through which a breath might pass. The jars made a soft, metronomic noise as he walked, a private punctuation that matched the clink of mooring chains and the distant, steady beat of a smith's hammer. People noticed him the way one noticed weather, a fact of the day that arrived and left without fuss. He kept a slim notebook in the inside pocket of his coat, the pages of it edged in salt from hands that had studied more things than one might expect. The notebook had once been a school exercise book, the cover creased and the stitching gone slick from use. He wrote in it as if he were writing down the contours of a map, and he believed, truly, that its lines had weight. Each entry was an economy of syllables, a name, a date, the smell of the regret if it could be named, the citrus of an old quarrel, the iron sore of a regret about a boat. At night he would add small margins where he noted the trade's outcomes, the quiet alterations in a household's rhythm. That ledger was less an instruction manual than an ethics, to which edges of a shadow he had trimmed, to whom he had given a softer silhouette, and what terms had been paid an evening of light, a bag of coins, a promise to keep silence. The town understood, in the way that small places understand the utility of an unusual profession, that Jonah's work was practical. People do not easy themselves free of their troubles for nothing. A widow might offer a jar of cloves, a cobbler might promise a week's mending, a boy might trade a borrowed jacket for a weekend without the memory that burned his mother. The terms were never the same twice. They were as informal as the gossip at the fish shed, yet somehow binding. A promise was a promise here as much as any coin. Jonah observed those exchanges with a careful modesty. He was not the sort to pronounce absolutions. He fitted shadows as a tailor might fit a coat, by measure and by the sound inside the body. Shadows in this town were not the obliging followers taught in children's rhymes. They answered, sometimes too plainly, to what had been left unsaid. A man hauling crates might walk with a shadow that looked like a sob held behind the jaw. A woman wiping her hands at the stall could have a shadow that trembled in the shape of a lost name. They were articulate. When the fog lay heavy and the lamps were poor, these silhouettes became more distinct, as if the mist allowed regrets to unspool their edges. Jonah had learned, a long time ago and by degrees, how to see those edges. He learned to wait at the right distance close enough to hear the thin, private things one sometimes said aloud to no one, far enough away to avoid being suspected of prying. He worked in small rituals. He always put the jar to the heel first and left the opening a little wide so the shadow could find its way in. He hummed only the briefest of tunes, a half-remembered lullaby that seemed to loosen the shadow like a button undone. When he had it where he wanted it, he would screw the lid down and mark the jar with a single stroke on his hand. The replacement shadow arrived folded, simpler, softer, a shadow cut of the original's harshest corners. It did not erase memory, it smoothed it. The people who accepted such trades left with less of the acute edge of their trouble, and they returned to their lives with a steadier step. Sometimes that steadiness came at ridiculous practical cost, a deckhand who no longer recalled a coarse marker, a wife who no longer remembered the exact sound of a lover's last quarrel. Mostly, though, the trades were domestic miracles, small repairs that permitted washing dishes without tears, morning bread eaten without the stale aftertaste of some unattended grief. On the morning the chapter of the town began to name itself to Jonah, the fog had the particular grayness of a damp animal, and the quay smelled of boiled net and coffee gone cold. He had been up early. His hands felt ready. At his first stop, a market stall where a woman sold fried fish and rolls, he found a mother with a child swaddled and a coat held too tight around the shoulders for lack of warmth. The child's shadow had a little sawtooth at its center that looked, upon inspection, like a missing lullaby. The mother had the look of someone who had catalogued suffering and dispensed it in small rationed measures. Jonah had already fixed the jar at his belt, the lid loose enough for a shadow to press against. He kneeled with that careful, unobtrusive patience he had perfected, and the woman watched him with an expression that mixed both hope and the caution of someone spending a precious coin. He did not ask many questions. He bent his head and let his sight find the shadow's edge. The child, restless and damp, smelled faintly of sea salt and milk. Jonah hummed the short tune. He always used the one with no words, more a pattern of intervals than a melody, and the shadow lifted, as if relieved, and flowed like ink into the jar. The act was clinical, domestic as washing a shirt, and the mother exhaled a sound that made Jonah look up. He offered then, the replacement shadow softer, a little dimmer, less precise in its complaints. "You sure about this?" she asked, not to him entirely but as if asking someone who had been a witness to the process. "If you ask me to make it less sharp, I will," Jonah said, and he meant it. He did not offer counsel beyond that. He had learned, by experience, that words could complicate the transaction. She paid with a handful of coins, a promise to leave him a candle on his doorstep that night, and the obvious relief of someone who could, for a few hours at least, sleep without waking to the same sound. The child relaxed as if a small knot had been taken from his back. Jonah sealed the jar, set it in the basket between baskets of sprats and preserved lemons, and wrote a line in his notebook: "Market child light-eased, evening candle, 7:12. It surprised no one that such work went on. What was surprising to Jonah was how quickly such small reliefs acquired a social logic. The woman at the stall lowered her gaze and then, with a quick motion, smoothed some fabric behind the counter as if to tidy, not the stall, but the memory that had had its corners shaved. The regulars at the fish stalls glanced at Jonah as one might glance at a necessary though slightly disagreeable neighbor. He felt useful more in the sense of being a hinge than in the sense of having been heroic. Old Tilda watched him from the doorway of a shop that smelled of dried herbs and the faint iron smell of stitches. She was a small woman, with knees that had seen more years of bending than most, and eyes so still that they seemed to stop the motions of other people's faces. He had met her twice before, and both times she had been more archive than person, a woman who remembered births and marriages with a steadiness that bordered on ceremony. She watched as he moved through the market, and when he passed her doorway she stepped out with a slow gait, and did not yet speak. Later, as Jonah straightened a dropped string of net by an old piling, she came up and put something in his hand without preamble. It was a bead, small and dark as a night without stars. "For keeping," she said. "So you remember the weight." He turned the bead over in his fingers like a small, heavy thing and looked at her. "It will chip," he said, thinking it a practical objection. "Let it," she said. "If you keep everything pristine you will never feel how things wear you back." There was rebuke in that, but also an offer. He had known, in a way he could not name, that the ledger and the jars were not merely tools but ways of keeping his own distance. Old Tilda's gift was a reminder that distance, too, had a cost. Jonah kept moving. He described the town to himself in a private, almost liturgical language, the quay as a long throat that swallowed boats and gave them back shaped by salt. The warehouses like patient mouths, the rope-strewn lanes, a slow braiding of the community's daily efforts. He noticed small things that other people might hardly stop to see: how the shadow from an overturned barrel had the precise silhouette of a quarrel, how the lamplight likewise seemed to gather memories and hold them for a moment before the fog took them back. He fitted his work into that geography, the jars at his hip like beacons of practical mercy. A child chased a gull, and the gull's shadow on the paving looked like a small regret that had been denied a name. Jonna could have stopped and scooped it into a jar, and the scene would have been like wiping a small smudge from a table. But he did not. He had rules as carefully observed as the customs of the harborman: never take a shadow without consent. Do not claim to absolve what must be remembered. Keep careful records. Barter with things that mattered to the person, not with the person's dignity. People called him odd sometimes, but not unkindly. There was gratitude in their faces when a family returned to the quay with steadier hands, when a husband could speak his wife's name without his throat closing. Jonna catalogued those returns as much as he catalogued the trades themselves. Each successful exchange felt like a small, private restoration. He told himself, sometimes, that this was why he had begun, because it was better to be used than to be ignored. Near noon, when the sun tried to push the fog aside and failed, Jonna sat on a low step to write. The page took his hand and he wrote slowly, each entry a small ceremony. Market Mother Lullaby eased, candle promised, 9:13. He paused, as if listening to the letters. Across the water a bell rang somewhere in a shape that meant someone had come in from sea. A sound like an oath and a summons both. It sent a tremor through the fog. He thought, not for the first time, about ledger keepers and about people who record other people's lives for reasons that are not purely practical. He had friends who kept lists, old Tilda with her roster of births and names, the harbor clerk with his tidy rows of cargo and fines. He wondered, with that particular, private unease that visits people who have a craft of their own, who tended the registrar of shadows beyond the edges of the market. The thought was slight, but it lodged itself in his chest like a small stone. He closed the book and slipped it back into his pocket, the paper warm against his palm. He put his hand to his jars and felt, for a moment, the small, steady weight of what he kept. He walked on, back into the bustle as if he belonged entirely to it. A woman called his name, no, not his name, rather the word for the boy who kept things, and he turned with a small bow and offered a smile that was narrow and deliberate. The morning continued routine and precise, but the edges of it had acquired a quieter definition. There were rules, and there were people who kept to them. And there were networks of kindness that needed tending as much as nets needed mending. When the day ended, he would shut the shop of no shop he held no address. Only tugs and alleys, and set his jars in a row on his windowsill, where the lamplight would make them look like small islands. He would count coins and note how he had been paid in time as much as in money. But in the little space between the jars and the ledger there lived a question barely formed and easily dismissed. Might there be a place where shadows were kept not to soften them but to order them, catalogued in a way that made them useful for other ends? He told himself, as he often did, that such notions were the sort of gossip that came from the harbor council rooms and from men who wore too many coats. If there was such a place, it was far away from his neat, domestic ethics. Old Tilda watched him go with the slow approval of someone who keeps a ledger of a different kind. She did not ask him to change the work he did. She simply said, "Mind the bead," and that was both benediction and caution. Jonna felt the weight of it inside his palm for the rest of the day, a ballast that steadied him, and under it, a noticing that something else less visible, more organized, kept a different watch of the town. He moved toward the next day in the small, steady way that he had come to inhabit, jars clinking softly, the ledger warm in his breast, his eyes attentive to the edges of people's lives. The fog took and returned everything, and as he walked he could not tell whether the town's economy of sorrow was an instrument of mercy or simply another kind of commerce. That, he thought, might be a question to keep for an evening when the lamps were lit and old Tilda's back room smelled of herbs. For now, there were people who needed the edges of their shadows trimmed and a ledger that needed another line written. He bent, as he always did, to the small, honest work. Jonna had a way of listening that made people think he was half a clock and half a mouth. He would stand with his hands folded as if to keep the tide out, or he would perch on a kitchen chair as if on a stub of harbor wall. And he would let a silence lay itself between himself and whoever sat with him. In that quiet he attended not to words, which the town could supply in abundance, but to the shadow immediately at a person's feet, its tremor, its length, the parts of it that were knotted and dim like old rope. The trade he offered was economical in gesture. It was never spectacle. Jonah abhorred spectacle. He had learned that people already carried enough theater in their faces. His work began, always, with a bowl of water that smelled faintly of iron and long-dried seaweed. He kept the bowl on a low table in his small room above the chandler's, and he kept beside it a spool of twine, a stub of sealing wax, a thimble, and his ledger thin, its leather softened into a shape that fit his palm. The ledger was where he kept receipts of debt. He called them notes of exchange. Others called them catalogues of the impossible. He preferred the former name. Mrs. Home came on a Tuesday that had the peculiar clarity of the mornings after a storm. Her son, Arthur, stood in the doorway like a tree that had been pruned back too close. He looked at the floor. He was small and his collar was damp where the salt air had settled. Has been waking at night, Mrs. Holmes said, as if speaking of a boil. All the time. He'll sit up and call names. I can't sleep because I listened for him. I heard of you. Old Tilda suggested. Old Tilda had indeed suggested. That was often how people made the first step. A neighbor with a known partiality, a shopkeeper who understood when grief required interfaces with barter. Jonna watched Mrs. Home as she smoothed a handkerchief across her lap until the fabric made a small sound like a pipe clearing. Jonah did not ask how the family came to that particular regret. He had learned to keep such queries in reserve. Instead he moved slowly to the floor and put the bowl between himself and Arthur's feet. He lit the lamp on the low table, and the room rewrote itself in the lamplight. The kettle's flake of steam became a ribbon. The crusts of bread on the plate took on the same texture only the sea could give. The shadow at Arthur's feet did not speak, and Jonah knew by now that that silence meant more than words sometimes. He leaned forward until his nose was close to the water and listened. A person's regret, Jonah had come to believe, sat in the body like a pocket of weather. It could be rained upon or it could be folded up and carried. The shadow told him where the seam was, how easy it was to press the fabric together without leaving ragged edges. For Arthur the shadow was thin at the toes and taut across the arch. It moved with the kind of nervous twitch that belonged to someone who woke to check a door. It smelled faintly of small rooms and the public houses by the fish stalls, a memory of too many people passing through, each scent layered upon the other. Jonah took his spool of twine and set his fingers into the water as if testing its depth. "Tell me what it's like when he wakes," he said. It was not a question that required immediate answer. Often the telling was a ritual of its own, and the information Jonah gained came partly from what paused in the telling. Mrs. Holmes spoke of the early waking and a lullaby the boy could not finish, how the voice that used to steady him had long since frayed. She said it in short, careful sentences. Where other collectors might have promised full erasure, Jonah selected a softening, a thread of forgetfulness that would keep the shape of the loss without the bristling edge that ate into sleep. He would not, he told her quietly, unmake the memory of who might have been gone. He would only keep the sharpness from cutting every night. The agreement was a bargain as old as the docks, an evening of light Mrs. Holmes coined Jonah's time, and a promise inscribed. She tightened her hand on the handkerchief. The practice itself held a kind of choreography. Jonah warmed his fingers over the lamp, cupped his hands, and extended them to the place the shadow occupied. Palms trembling perhaps not from cold but from the small seriousness of touching what belonged to someone else. He breathed with a softness that might have been compassion or mere habit. From his inner pocket he took a small piece of waxed cloth folded into the size of a coin and placed it on the floor. He recited, in a voice no one else would have believed necessary, the small lines old Tilda had taught him. Words that were not exactly incantation, but that required a shape of attention to be spoken properly. They were fewer than most prayers, and their economy fit Jonah's temperament. When he felt the shadow ease under his palms, sometimes like a cat shifting on a winter rug, Sometimes, like a small bell losing its pitch, he would wrap the softened edge around the waxed cloth and bind it with twine. The act was both literal and symbolic, a knot to hold the softened shape in its new form. Then he boiled the water quickly, set the cloth in it, and took it out, wrung it once with his thimble-stiff fingers, and set it aside to dry. The shadow did not return to the floor in its old shape. Arthur sat straighter. Mrs. Holmes' eyes were embroidered with relief. Jonah kept the wrapped piece in a small jar labeled with Mrs. Holmes' neat script, "Home Arthur night waking softened." He noted the transaction in his ledger in a hand that had been steadied by repetition. The page recorded the who, the what, the cost, and the tiny ordinance of consent, Mrs. Holmes' folded promise not to ask Jonah to remove any more than he had agreed. Jonah's vow not to commit the memory to any other use. He did not write, and the ledger did not ask him to write, the precise shape of what had been lost. Sometimes the omission felt like mercy. Other times it felt like collusion. He made that decision, and then he closed the book and rubbed at the corner with a thumb that still smelled of the sea. Thomas Reed was easier to find. Dock workers had habits that made them visible, a specific gait, a set of calices, a way of shifting a crate that told Jonah where to look for a man who had given an evening of light for the chance to go back to his work steady-handed. Jonah encountered Thomas beneath a string of billboards, the gulls' cries rubbed out by the sound of winches. Thomas's shadow had been an old thing, a stubborn, bracing piece that kept him from being able to rest with other people, that kept his temper hawkish and his hands clenched around compasses and crates. The trade with Thomas was different than the one with Mrs. Holmes. There was no hush of a parlour to keep them. They stood in cold air, their breath visible. Thomas arrived with a scar on his knuckle like a small, dried-up hook. He did not want to talk at first. Jonah watched his jaw work as if it were testing whether he could open. "You want this done quick," Thomas said, not looking properly at Jonah, but at a crate that needed lifting. "I can't be soft at my work." "No one asks you to be less than safe," Jonah said. He had learned to offer wording that did not imply moral lecture. "Just less corrosive when you sleep." Thomas' mouth kicked at the corner. He let Jonah stand near the light of the alley lamp and make the same small arrangements he made in a parlor: twine, wax, a dip in the bowl. The shadow there loosened not like a knot but like a muscle unclenching. Thomas' face shifted afterwards in a way that would have been easy to miss for anyone not accustomed to reading the small changes in men who had been taught to keep the sea's hardness in their bones. He lifted a child's small glove, someone else's gloves left on a crate, and held it to his chest for a moment, as if to test something he had nearly forgotten. At the end of the day, Jonah walked back with the ledger under his arm. The town folded into a different kind of evening when the sun slid down, lamps went up, noises compressed into their duties. He stopped in at Old Tilda's because there was a small ritual of rapport between them. Old Tilda's shop was the sort of place that kept the air of the town's memory, shelves of jars filled with dried flowers, letters tied with twine, a bell that never quite rang entirely when the door was opened. She regarded Jonah without hurried speech. She had an eye that had the patience of someone who had watched births and funerals and all the unglamorous passages in between. "You were busy," she said without reproach. Her voice had the rasp of wool being rubbed. "You look as if you'd been handling needles." Jonah set the ledger on the counter. He liked the way the ledger looked under Tilda's light, a thing modest and peculiar. He told her, in the way one gives a report to a magistrate with whom one is intimate, the facts: 2 trades, the costs, the small differences in the way Thomas had said the word sleep. He did not tell her the surprise at Thomas lifting the child's glove. Some moments he wrapped and kept. Old Tilda did not offer grand pronouncements. She took a cloth and put it over the ledger as if to keep the pages from the gulls. "You've got your hands in a market," she said. "Not all markets trade in goods you can put on a shelf. Remember what I told you about the seams." He remembered. She had taught him the little codicils that separated a good trade from a careless one, how to ask for consent without shame, how to make sure there was someone else who could corroborate what had been done if a question came later, and most importantly, how to keep the ledger as a moral object rather than as a list of tallies. Sometimes, Tilda added, the relief is only a different kind of remembering. You can't always buy a thing back by pretending you never wanted it. Her cautions had sharpened the edges of Jonah's practice. Where at first he had seen himself simply as a middleman of sorrow, he now felt the ledger's weight like a button on his chest. Each line was a compromise between mercy and the fidelity of remembering. He took to writing with care, making small marginal notes, the cadence of a person's voice when consenting, the presence of any witness, the smell that accompanied the shadow. These were private annotations saved not to be cunningly used but to anchor a particular exchange in a context that might later be understood. There were unforeseen things that came with such apprenticeship. Once, when Jonah had been new, he had traded away a pocket of guilt from a woman who then ceased to recognize certain faces in the neighborhood. The woman returned to trade a year later for a different softness. She told Jonah in tears that she couldn't remember the names of the neighbors who had once kept her company under their drying nets. What he had meant for mercy had become an erasure for someone else. He had folded the memory into the ledger and closed the book and slept with a small, sharp cold in his chest for many nights. It was episodes like that which taught him to spend more time in the listening. Ask me the shape of it, old Tilda would say. Let them tell you the corners. If you press too hard you will smooth off syllables that shouldn't be sanded away. By the time Jonah returned to his room the lamp had been wind-blown into a thin, confident glow. He placed the ledger on his table and arranged the objects of his day with the almost desperate orderliness of someone who needed to make sense of chaos by straightening it into lines. He wrote out the day's entries with a hand that had long been trained to conserve gestures. Each notation was a miniature oath. He traced the cost in minutes and coins, and sometimes, when the trade had pushed to the edge of what he felt right returning, a small letter, C for chosen compromise, R for returned emotion, S for softened. He paused often. He left space in the margins where a future annotation might be needed, if the person returned, if a witness contradicted, if his own conscience called later. Sometimes, when his pen lingered, Jonah saw the ledger as a map of things he had touched, dots and lines that made a town he loved look like a cartographer's private joke. He didn't always enjoy the clarity that came with that map. The night closed with small noises. A fisherman muttered as he walked by below. A cart's wheel scraped. Jonah could hear old Tilda moving in the street, her steps measured. He put the ledger away and cleaned his tools as if preparing for work the next day. The twine was wound, the wax put back into its tin, the bowl rinsed. He sat by the window and watched the fog press soft against the glass. Beyond the glass, the far side of the quay was a sheet of dim samenesses. Lamps showed like tired stars. He thought, as he often did at such hours, about the gestures he had not made. He had not asked certain questions of Mrs. Home he could have asked, for fear of making her choose something she was not ready to keep. He had not told Thomas the small thing his face had revealed. He had not, so far, allowed anyone to look inside the ledger. That secrecy kept people safe and made the ledger an instrument of unequal power. He had begun to care more about the differences between relief and amputation. It was a distinction that sat at the core of his work and that distinguished, for him, an honest trade from one done for show. He thought of the woman whose neighborhood was washed from her mind. He thought of the way the child's glove had stayed in Thomas's hand longer than required. He felt around for a rule he could follow that would keep him from making the same error twice. Outside, from a rope bridge across the fish stalls, there came the sound of a footfall that had a different complaint than the usual traffic of the docks. It was a lighter, quicker patience. Jonah moved to the window and looked. The bridge tossed small shadows across the quay. He could just make out the angle of a body against the fog. It was as if the town, keeping its usual appointments of commerce, hinted that not all interruptions were meant to be closed. He closed his ledger partly because it was a book and partly